Welcome to this special evening organized by Radboud Reflects, Stichting Spinozalens and publisher Credo Facto. My name is Kiki Koolman. I have a background in political theory and in African studies. I work at the university as a junior teacher in political theory, and I'm a programmer, and I moderate evenings like this, which I'm very happy to be a part of. But you're not here for that. You're here for a very special guest this evening, which is Professor Martha Nussbaum. Some of you might have already been to the introductory lecture on her work last week. But for the others, a short introduction. Her big breakthrough was in 1986 with the book Fragility of Goodness, in which she gave a plea for vulnerability and the importance of vulnerability in the exploration of ethics. She is thereafter most famous, of course, for a capabilities approach, on which she will also talk today. The capabilities approach talks about human capabilities in the first place in the past, where humans have different capabilities, which she says we need to be able to explore, to make use of in order to flourish, in order to develop ourselves. And therefore, in a just society, we should give people the chance to work out these capabilities. And over the past years, for a while now, she has also applied this capabilities approach to the question of animal justice, which is a very interesting topic. And finally now, she's coming up with a whole book on this topic. The book is called Justice for Animals, in Defense for Animals. And the book will be released in January, including a Dutch translation as well, also in January. I got the privilege of already reading the book in advance, so I'm very happy about that. But all of you will be able to hear more about it in the upcoming lecture. Before I give the floor, it's good to know that after the lecture there will be a lot of space for questions from you. So please, if you have any critical question or enthusiastic comment, please hold on to that thought. For now, Professor Nussbaum, I invite you. Welcome back to Nijmegen, although it's virtually. In the past, you've been here physically. It's really nice to have you. It's a big honor, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. And Kiki, it's really good to meet you. I wish I could meet you personally, but thank you for that nice introduction. I should say that the full title of my book is actually Justice for Animals, Our Collective Responsibility. And I really mean that. That is, I think everyone in this room and this virtual space too, has a responsibility to do something about injustices to animals. So I'll now begin. Animals suffer injustice at our hands. The cruelties of the factory farming industry, poaching and trophy hunting, assaults on the habitats of many creatures, and innumerable other instances of cruelty and neglect. Human domination is everywhere. In the seas where marine mammals die from ingesting plastic, in the skies where migratory birds die in large numbers from air pollution and collisions with buildings, and obviously on the land where the habitats of many large mammals have been destroyed almost beyond repair. Addressing these large problems requires dedicated work and effort, but it also requires a good normative theory to direct our efforts. And I'm going to argue here that an approach based on my version of the capabilities approach is the one we need, and I'll show how it directs our efforts better than rival approaches. So, section 1, justice as thwarted striving. What is injustice? Here are some stories that I think will yield an intuitive account. My examples will be only the smallest sample of what can befall an animal, and only a sampling of animal kinds. But I will pair two descriptions, one of the animal going about its own life, flourishing, and another of the animal brought to grief by wrongful treatment. Because non-human animals are so often treated as mere things, not individual sentient beings, and because one aspect of that thing-like treatment has been the refusal of a proper name, scientists today insist on giving proper names to the individual animals they study. I follow this practice here, taking names from both fact and fiction. Let me then introduce you to three particular animals. Virginia is a sensitive female elephant in Kenya, described and named by elephant scientist Joyce Poole in her memoir, Coming of Age with Elephants. Hal Whitehead is a great whale scientist, especially focused on whale song, so I've given his name to a humpback whale who is proficient at singing, one of a group that I observed while on a whale watching trip near the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. No fictional pig is more imperious and more striking than Empress of Blandings in the novels of P.G. Wodehouse, a noble black Berkshire sow in superb condition who wins many medals. So first, the mother elephant, Virginia's story. Virginia has large amber eyes. When she hears music that she likes, she stands very still and her eyelids droop. Joyce Poole spends her days with the whole matriarch of Greek, and she finds that Virginia, smaller than the chief matriarch Victoria, has a particular fondness for Joyce's singing. Amazing Grace is her favorite. Often, however, Virginia's on the move, covering huge tracts of grassland, her feet padding noiselessly across the floor of Kenya's Amboseli National Park. Her new baby elephant walks beneath her belly, sheltered by that enormous maternal frame. Elephants are wonderful mothers, highly protective of their young, and even known to sacrifice their lives to save young elephants from danger. Now, consider something that might happen, that often does happen. Virginia lies on her side, dead, her tusks and trunk hacked off by a machete, her face a bloody red hole. The ivory trade flourishes despite many attempts to curb it, and the market for animal trophies such as tails and trunks flourishes with few impediments. It's not even illegal to import such trophies into the United States. The other females gather around her and try vainly to lift her body with their trunks. Eventually, giving up the effort, they sprinkle earth and grass upon her body. The baby elephant is missing, taken, very likely, to sell to some zoo, often in the United States, that's not too particular about origins. Now, the humpback whale, Hal's story. Our small whale watching boat cuts through the choppy surf off of Australia's Great Barrier Reef. In the distance, several pods of humpback whales appear, breaching and slapping their tails and flukes. Their huge backs gleam in the sun. One of them is Hal. Over the boat's motor, we hear the whales singing. The patterns of sound too complex for our ears to chart them, although we know that humpback whale song has a complicated structure and enormous variety, and is constantly changing, sometimes apparently out of sheer fashion and interest in novelty. A variant that originates here may make its way all the way to Hawaii in a year's time as whales imitate one another. The sound is beautiful to us and profoundly mysterious. Now, look at a different possible Hal. Washed up, dead, on a beach in the Philippines. His once healthy frame is emaciated. Inside, researchers find 88 pounds of plastic trash, including bags, cups, and other single-use items. Another whale, similarly choked on plastic, was found to contain in the refuse a pair of flip-flops. Hal has starved to death. Plastic gives whales the sensation of fullness, but no nutrition. Eventually, there's no room for real food to enter. Some of the plastic in Hal's stomach has been there so long that it is calcified, turned into a plastic brick. He will not sing again. And now the sow, the story of Empress of Blandings. Empress of Blandings is a noble black Berkshire sow of enormous size, cared for as a favorite companion on the estate of Blandings Castle. She loves her trough, where appetizing food is always offered her by her human caretaker, whose name is Cyril Wellbeloved. When Wellbeloved has to go to jail for a short time for drunken and disorderly conduct, she begins to pine and loses her appetite. Her human family, especially the very pig-focused Lord Emsworth, worries helplessly about her well-being, tempting her with various treats, but in vain. By a stroke of good fortune, however, Jamie Belford turns up at Blandings, and his skill in hog calling, learned during a period of work on a farm in Nebraska, brings the Empress back to her usual good spirits. She eats with gusto, making, quote, a sort of gulpy, gurgly, plobby, squishy, wafflesome sound, end quote, that delights Lord Emsworth. Shortly thereafter, she takes her first silver medal at the 87th Shropshire Agricultural Show in the Fat Pigs class. Now, imagine a different life for the Empress. Instead of flourishing among the kindly people and fostering surroundings of Blandings Castle and the gentle world of P.G. Woodhouse, where all beings are treated with love and humor, the Empress has the bad fate to be living on a hog farm in Iowa in the early 21st century. Now, newly pregnant, she's been thrust into what's called a gestation crate, a narrow metal enclosure just the size of her body, with no bedding, floored with slats of concrete or metal to allow waste to descend into sewage lagoons below. She cannot walk or turn around. She can't even lie down. No kindly hog caller speaks to her. No pig-loving humans admire and love her. No other pigs or other farm animals greet her. She's just a thing, a breeding machine. Most of the approximately 6 million sows in the United States are on factory farms, and these crates are used in most states, though by now they've been banned in 9 states and in several countries. Sows in gestation crates show loss of bone mass from lack of exercise. They exhibit behaviors such as bar biting and tongue rolling, indicative of boredom and frustration. One type of frustration is being forced to defecate where they live, because sows, contrary to usual stereotypes, are very clean animals, and they normally choose to defecate far from where they sleep and eat. Another is deprivation of all society, for pigs are highly intelligent and social animals. Though the use of crates is given a kind of spurious justification on the grounds that sows not so confined will fight with one another, this specious argument simply assumes that the sows could not possibly be given enough room to go and come and move as they choose. In a poignant allusion to the fact that pigs are not mere objects that have a characteristic form of life, the Pew Commission on Industrial Farm Animal Production recommended in 2008, quote, the phase out within 10 years of all intensive confinement systems that restrict natural movement and normal behaviors, including swine gestation crates. Well, now you see that it's been more than 2018 that phase out was supposed to be, and it's now 2023, and nothing has happened. These stories summon us to both compassion and what I've elsewhere called transition anger. That is an anger that is not simply backward-looking and retributive, but forward-looking and corrective. We feel that is outrageous. It must not happen going forward. But why do we react this way? What do the 3 stories have in common? First, in all 3 cases, we're aware that we're dealing with a sentient being, a creature who feels pain, who perceives, who has its own perspective on the world. Second, the creature is trying to live, and to live a life characteristic of an animal of that kind. That's what the good stories bring out, describing a flourishing life for each animal. Third, the animal's striving for flourishing has been thwarted, and it has been thwarted by conduct that is either deliberate or negligent. These, for me, are the basic intuitive ingredients of injustice, the wrongful thwarting of a sentient being's striving. So now, section 2, 3 flawed approaches. Let me now examine 3 prominent philosophical approaches that have been directing practical and legal efforts to combat injustice toward animals. I confine myself here to Western philosophy, and I don't even delve back far into its history, where late Platonism, in the works of Porphyry and Plutarch, made striking contributions to thinking about animal rights. As for non-Western thought, I note that Indian, Buddhist, and Hindu philosophy has rich resources for defending the rights of animals, and an Indian court has recently declared animals persons under Article 21 of the Indian Constitution, which makes it illegal to deprive a person of life or liberty without due process of law. But the first flawed approach is one that I call the so like us approach. It's based on the traditional idea of a scala naturae, that is a ladder of nature with humans securely at the top. Users of this approach, in particular legal activist Stephen Wise and his Non-Human Rights Project, argue that a group of creatures who seem to Wise to be very like humans in intelligence, especially great apes, but more recently they've included whales and elephants, should count as persons in law and should receive various protections on the grounds of their likeness to humans. It was used in the US unsuccessfully to argue for the transfer of a group of apes from an experimental facility to an animal sanctuary. And more recently, it was used to recommend the transfer of an elephant from a very bad kind of zoo confinement to an elephant sanctuary. There are many flaws with this approach. First, it offers nothing for the sufferings of so many creatures who are deemed not sufficiently like us. Indeed, by offering similarity to humans as the decisive reason for good treatment, it positively discourages attention to the predicaments of other animals. Second, it is deeply flawed empirically and lacking in curiosity, not willing to investigate the manifold forms of intelligence and cognitive complexity in our world. Intelligence and cognitive complexity take manifold forms in this world, and creatures from the octopus and marine creatures of many types to birds, amazingly versatile and long underestimated, have many different types of intelligence, some of which we humans do not possess. Birds can navigate over huge distances by picking up magnetic fields, a sensory apparatus we lack. Dolphins can determine what is inside an object by their sensory capacity for what's called echolocation, perceiving by the reverberation that comes back to them from the object. A surprising instance, a captive dolphin became aware of her human trainer's pregnancy before the trainer herself was even aware of it, and the dolphin signaled it to her. So, nature does not present a ladder, it presents instead amazing horizontal variety, each creature having the capacities suited to its ecological niche and its form of life. Third, the approach values animals for the wrong reasons, because of us, not because of them. It's narcissistic and complacent, first assuming our first place value, and then conceding that, well, some few other creatures manage to attain value by likeness. But each animal's goals are its own, and its life is its own. Second is the utilitarian approach, which began with Jeremy Bentham's clarion call to concern for animals in a famous long footnote in his introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, 1789. Bentham's overall view holds that the only good thing is pleasure and the only bad thing is pain. In this footnote, he insists that other animals are just as vulnerable to pain and suffering as humans are, and he predicts that the day will come when our harsh domination over animals will seem just as heinous as, says he, the slave trade now does to right-thinking people. I think he was somewhat exaggerating the degree to which British thought had progressed by 1789, and certainly ignoring atrocities in America. Just as the color of a person's skin should not be a reason for differentially bad treatment, he says, so too the, quote, villosity, that's the hairiness of the skin, and the curvature of the os sacrum, end quote, should not be a reason for the brutal oppression of animals. Bentham followed this up with other writings denouncing hunting and fishing for sport, although he still thought it was permissible to kill animals for food if done in a painless manner. Bentham's great student, John Stuart Mill, followed his lead, both writing about the rights of animals and leaving all of his money to the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. Today, utilitarian philosopher Peter Singer, their philosophical heir, has been a great leader in calling for the abolition of cruel practices to animals. This approach is a lot better, and it does zero in on a key issue in our exploitation of animals, namely pain. But it flattens the world too much. Animals do need freedom from pain, but they also need other things, the ability to move freely, to play, to choose their own paths through the world, to enjoy social relationships. Furthermore, sometimes animals who have never been exposed to these good things do not actually feel pain when they're without them. They form what economists call adaptive preferences. So, as in the human case, the utilitarian criterion can be an ally of an unjust status quo. Another problem is that the utilitarian goal is a state, pleasure, or in Singer's version, preference satisfaction. So the value of agency is neglected. People don't just want to end up in a state of satisfaction. They want to strive and to attain what they attain by their own efforts. Finally, what utilitarianism recommends is not individual-focused enough. The goal is either the greatest total pleasure or the greatest average pleasure, depending on which version we use. So, complicated empirical calculations are required in order to balance the pleasure humans take in meat eating against the pain of the animals who are eaten. And there's no guarantee at all that the animal protective result will actually win. The condition of those at the bottom of society's ladder does not have any special importance, a notorious problem for utilitarianism generally. Third is the Kantian approach of Christine Korsgaard's important recent book called Fellow Creatures. This is a really wonderful book. This approach does better still, developing an attractive account of what it is to treat an animal as an end rather than a mere means. In many important respects, its practical recommendations dovetail with my own. Korsgaard diverges from Kant, who actually held that animals are just property that we may use as we please, and she develops a promising approach using both Kantian and Aristotelian materials. And I should say with great pleasure that Korsgaard was my dissertation student long ago, and she wrote her dissertation on Kant and Aristotle. But Korsgaard clings too much to Kant to satisfy me. She insists that humans are the only creatures capable of normative thinking and self-direction. And although she doesn't think this makes humans better, she does think that for this reason, the other creatures can only be what she calls passive citizens, not active participants in indicating what justice is for them. We should criticize this argument both empirically and normatively. Human ethical capacities are part of our animal heritage, and we share them to a greater or lesser degree with many animals. Moreover, it doesn't make normative sense to me to conclude that a creature not capable of this very high-level ethical thought cannot be an active citizen. Creatures of many kinds, including human children and people with severe cognitive disabilities, lack those special Kantian abilities, and yet we do consider them active citizens, allowing their preferences to be heard when laws are made, even though in many circumstances they will have to be represented by a guardian, or what's most people in that disability movement prefer the word collaborator. So why not say the same about animals? Section 3, the capabilities approach, striving and forms of life. Let me now turn to my own capabilities approach. As an approach to justice in the human world, it holds that a minimally just society will provide each and every citizen with a threshold level of 10 significant capabilities. Capabilities are substantive opportunities for choice, not just inner abilities or abstract possibilities. So don't put the list up yet, and I'll tell you when to put it up. As an approach to justice for the other animals, my approach holds that all sentient creatures, that is, all who have an internal subjectivity, a point of view on the world, a category that includes all vertebrates and some invertebrates, ought to have the opportunity to live a flourishing life in accordance with the characteristic life form of their own species. Let me now elaborate. So subsection A, a virtual constitution. In the human case, the capabilities approach supplies a template for constitution making. The list has both content and a tentative threshold for each item. A nation aiming at minimal justice can consult it and also consult its own particular environment and history and frame its own list with more locally specific accounts of each of the major capabilities on the list. For two reasons, this approach to the other animals is not possible at present. First, the other animals often roam across national borders or occupy regions of the air and sea that are not the property of any single nation. So a national constitution would not be sufficient to protect migratory species. Second, there is not anything like sufficient political will in most of the nations of the world to enact such protections anytime soon. Right now, therefore, the CA aims to supply a virtual constitution to which nations, states, and regions may look to try to improve or newly frame their animal protective laws. It's my hope that over time, this virtual constitution can increasingly become the object of what Rawls called a political overlapping consensus, both within each nation and across national boundaries. This will take time and work, but so too does the task of framing and protecting human rights. Still, this flexible approach permits nations to stride boldly ahead without waiting to get a global consensus. The basic goal is that all animals would have the opportunity to live lives compatible with their dignity and their striving up to a reasonable threshold level, and with exceptions for self-defense and the defense of others. Subsection B, lists and lives. Ideally, we should learn enough to make a separate list for each type of creature, putting on the list the things that matter most when it comes to survival and flourishing. In effect, the list is really made by the animals themselves as they express their deepest concerns as they try to live. The people who can be trusted to record the unheard voices of animals are people who have lived with a given type of animal for years and with love and sensitivity. Ideally, there should be a group of people for each species, because any individual is fallible. These guardians and listeners should know individual animals within the species in all their variety, and know the obstacles each creature faces and what interventions prove helpful. That means a huge number of different lists. However, I believe that if we focus on the large general rubrics of the CA list for humans as it exists now, it offers good guidance as a starting point in virtually all cases. Now, please show the audience the list. So this should come as no surprise, really, since the CA list captures, in effect, the shared terrain of vulnerable, striving animality that each species inhabits in its own way. So look at the boldface type, the big rubrics, not the small print after that. All strive for life, for health, for bodily integrity, for the opportunity to use what senses, imagination, and thought are characteristic for that kind of creature. Practical reasons might seem at first too human to be a good guide, but really it isn't. All creatures want the opportunity to make some key choices about how their lives will go, to be the makers of plans and decisions. Affiliation is crucial for all animals, though its types vary greatly. All seek to relate well to the world of nature around them, and this usually includes members of other species. Play and fun are not peculiar to humans, as of course it used to be thought that, oh, only humans have fun. But now researchers increasingly understand that that's not true. They're key aspects of animals' sociability. And all animals seek types of control over their material and social environment. If there are other large rubrics pertinent to animal lives that the human list omits, I can't think of them now, but would be totally open to expanding the large rubrics of the list if any should be convincingly brought forward. So now you can take down the list. People might worry that such a list is bound to be anthropomorphic, verging on some of the errors of the so like us approach. I understand this charge, but I think it's mistaken. The list was made up not by thinking of what is distinctively human, but by thinking in very general terms about vulnerable and striving animality, a topic Aristotle already addressed in the small work on which I wrote my doctoral dissertation long decades ago in 1976, on the motion of animals. In that work, he proposes what he calls a common explanation for why and how animals move through the world to get the things they need, allowing for significant variations at the species level, but allowing that at a general level we can find a common pattern. I think so too, though we must always be on our guard against obtuseness or self-privileging perception. Sometimes the common explanation will include items within the finer rubrics of the human list that appear at first not to matter to the lives of animals. Consider freedom of association and freedom of speech. Well, what are most zoos but means of denying freedom of association to animals? As for speech, animals express what they need and want in many ways, often very sophisticated, often possessing even syntactic complexity. Under formal US law, freedom of speech pertains to many forms of expressive symbolic activity, not just to words in speech or on paper. So why should this legal category, which does include, for example, burning the US flag is taken to be a form of speech. So this legal category, why should it not be thought to include the ways in which animals speak? It certainly could if animals only had legal standing in the first place. It's not that they don't speak, it's that we humans usually don't listen. Animals are not free to speak, however, when their complaints are ignored, when information about bad conditions in the factory farming industry are systematically screened from public view, when even human allies of the afflicted pigs and chickens are prevented by laws that are called ag-gag laws, that they're putting gag on the people who want to expose the agriculture conditions from describing those conditions. So these laws say it's illegal to report or photograph these conditions. Freedom of speech is hugely pertinent to animals, and it's important for exactly the reasons that John Stuart Mill, who of course was a defender of animal rights, gave when he defended free speech in On Liberty. Free speech gives information we need to make our society better. It challenges complacency and smugness. It brings forward unfashionable positions that deserve and indeed require a hearing. Some finer rubrics of the human list matter for animals in a slightly different way. Some of the specific subcategories seem to be not ones that animals themselves would use. For example, freedom of the press, political participation. However, let's stop and think again. Animals don't write newspaper articles, but the free circulation of information about their predicament is a crucial part of their good in this world where humans dominate all animal lives. Just as the Great Famine in China was not known even to Chairman Mao for a long time because of the absence of a free press, so too restrictions such as ag-gag laws prevent information about animal suffering from getting out into the public domain where action can actually be taken. To be sure, the articles and books will have to be written by humans, and the videos will have to be photographed by humans, but they matter for and in the lives of animals whose voices of complaint they record and whose intolerable conditions they display. Much the same is true of political participation. Most animals, though often political enough within their own species group, have little interest in political participation in a human-dominated world and are unaware of elections, assemblies, and offices. Nonetheless, what happens there matters hugely for them. In the human-dominated world, politics determines the rights and privileges of all denizens of a given place and makes crucial decisions about matters of welfare, habitat, and so forth. So it matters that animals have a political say, which means, I believe, legal standing and legal representation. Right now, we allow surrogate representation for humans with cognitive disabilities. And of course, in the law, none of us really go to court on our own. We always hire a lawyer anyway if we're smart. So the proposal involves nothing terribly surprising. Creatures who live in a place should have a say in how they live. At the level of the finer concrete rubrics of the list, there will then be surprising instances of overlap. At this level, however, there will also be much divergence, and we should always be open to surprise and learning. Thus, each kind of animal has its own form of social organization and even of sense perception. Some animals, as I mentioned, have senses we lack: echolocation, navigation by magnetic fields, and usually the senses that we do have are realized very differently in animal lives, different types of hearing, sight, perhaps especially smell. Only painstaking and loving study will show what should be said. Subsection C, fertile functioning's corrosive disadvantages. So this is based on, these terms are taken from the excellent book by Jonathan Wolfe and Avner de Shalit called Disadvantage, which develops a version of the capabilities approach. Because the approach I envisage is specific to each type of animal life, its demands are many and heterogeneous. But within each case, and even across many cases, there are likely to be capabilities that are particularly fertile, promoting good lives across the board, and capability failures that are especially damaging. For all animals, subjection to arbitrary human violence is a corrosive disadvantage, whether it takes the form of whales' vulnerability to harpooning, elephants' vulnerability to poaching, female pigs' confinement in gestation crates, or a dog's vulnerability to a so-called owner's cruelty and neglect. Another corrosive disadvantage across the board is environmental degradation, which causes lethal conditions, whether of air or water, for many species and depletes their habitats. So the opposite of these ills, ban on cruel practices and a dedication to environmental cleanup, will prove fertile, enhancing capabilities across the board for many animals. Subsection D, species members are individuals. So far, I've talked about a list for each species of animal, but for animals as for humans, each individual creature should be treated as an end. And animals are individuals not just numerically, meaning that each and every one matters, but also qualitatively. Each species member is subtly different from every other. People who live with companion animals know that the personalities and preferences of their companion dogs or cats are highly individual, and that what is good for one dog or one cat is not necessarily good for another. We usually fail to notice this variety in the case of animals with whom we don't live. But of course, scientists who do live with a given type of animal recognize and emphasize these differences. Each baboon, each elephant is a member of baboon or elephant society, but each individual has a unique way of inhabiting that world. So too, every type of animal that we've been able to study carefully. But if each individual is both separate from others, having its own life to live, not anyone else's, and qualitatively different in some ways from others, isn't it a mistake to frame the conception as centering around a species form of life? Isn't that to deny each animal's uniqueness? Isn't it obtuse, even objectifying, to speak of the dolphin or the dolphin form of life, rather than to create a separate story and a separate list for each individual dolphin? For example, for Fungi, the beloved dolphin in Dingle Bay, Ireland, whose disappearance in October 2020 has caused widespread distress. The inhabitants of Dingle Bay came to know Fungi over the decades as a dolphin with a unique personality, quirky, oddly solitary for a dolphin, atypically social toward humans. Why wouldn't Fungi's uniqueness be obliterated by an approach based on the species? All law is general, but good law is based on a knowledge of many particulars and can be revised when new particulars come to light. Moreover, the list is a list of capabilities, not mandatory functions. The opportunities it creates can be used by different creatures in different ways, or not used at all if the animal doesn't feel like using them. Capabilities are entitlements, a kind of rights. People typically do not think that the human rights approach reduces all humans to a cookie-cutter model. Rights are spaces within which varied individuals are free to choose. I think it's the same story for each kind of animal. We study communities belonging to a given species, and species, as we must always remember, is a rough term for what is common to many populations. It's not a metaphysical entity. We frame a list, then the qualitatively different species members can use those entitlements each in their own ways. Fungi is different from every other dolphin, but the capabilities that protect dolphins in general will also protect him and be used by him in his unique way. He doesn't have to socialize with a large pod if he doesn't want to. He's perfectly free to hang around the coast. And if one day he decides to go off in search of a larger pod, he's protected in that choice too. And that is actually one possibility for what happened to him, although given his relatively advanced age, death is another possibility. That's how the approach respects individual creatures, by creating protected spaces for them to seek flourishing, each in their own way. Through future judicial specification, the list will get refined. And if people who live with and care about a type of animal were to protest that the list is incomplete or mistaken, it can always be changed. One more point. Part of the goal will often include interspecies relationships. There are some animals whose lives are pretty much wrapped up in the life of their kind. Dolphins and elephants do not seem to rely on robust relationships with other species as a crucial element in their flourishing. Although that's not to say that a friendship across the species barrier might not arise under suitable conditions. But there are other animals whose form of life is far more relational across the species barrier. Dogs, cats, many horses, and farm animals who are not tortured. These animals cultivate relationships with one another, and they all seem to seek and need relationships with humans. So this simply gets built into the list we would make for each type of creature as a desideratum. Reliance on a species norm does not imprison the creature within its own species. Now, finally, to my last section, section 4, practical implications. In a way, the practical applications distinctive to this approach are obvious. Show respect for all forms of life, not just those that seem like us. Don't just focus on pain, but look at the whole form of life. Many zoos do not inflict pain, but they do thwart, in many cases, the animal's characteristic form of life. And don't treat animals as mere passive recipients of a handout, but allow their intelligent strivings and expressions of preference to determine the course of legal action. To return to my 3 stories, my approach would mean strenuous efforts worldwide to stop poaching and the abduction of young animals. It would mean an end to the whole factory farming industry in the short term, and in the longer term, an end to our reliance on killing animals for meat in favor of what they're really now increasingly developing, meat grown from stem cells without, or, we could start with plant-based meat as we've already done, but I think in the longer run, meat grown from stem cells without any killing is likely to be a more stable substitute. In Hal's case, it would mean a concerted effort on the part of all humanity to reform our heedless behavior with regard to plastic trash and aggressive cleanups to remove the plastic that is already out there. So I'll end this lecture with just one detailed example of legal implementation of the spirit of my approach, a happy harbinger of what may be a new era in law, in the form of a remarkable 2016 opinion by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in a case called Natural Resources Defense Council versus Pritzker. And I should say it's not the Pritzker who's the governor of Illinois, it's his sister who was Secretary of Commerce at the time. So versus Pritzker, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit ruled that the U.S. Navy violated the law in seeking to continue a sonar program that impacted the behavior of whales. To some extent, the opinion is a technical exercise in statutory interpretation of the Marine Mammal Protection Act. The court says that the fact that a program has negligible impact on marine mammals does not exempt it from a separate statutory requirement, namely that it establish means of, quote, effecting the least practicable adverse impact on, end quote, marine mammal species. What is significant and fascinating is that the argument relies heavily on a consideration of whale capabilities that the program disrupts. So I'll now quote from the opinion. Effects from exposures below 180 decibels can cause short-term disruption or abandonment of natural behavior patterns. These behavioral disruptions can cause affected marine mammals to stop communicating with one another, to flee or avoid an insonified area, to cease foraging for food, to separate from their calves, and to interrupt mating. LFA sonar can also cause heightened stress responses for marine mammals. So notice even the rubric of emotional health is on their minds. Such behavioral disruptions can force marine mammals to make trade-offs like delaying migration, delaying reproduction, reducing growth, or migrating with reduced energy reserves. The opinion does not give whales legal standing. The whales are not the plaintiffs. In other words, they need the human NGO to be the plaintiff. No such radical legal move is necessary to reach the clear end that the program is unacceptable. Because the whales did not have legal standing, they had to depend on the luck of having protection through the Marine Mammal Protection Act, a law made by human legislators, but with real concern for the interests of whales. The whales also had to depend on judges who read the law imaginatively. And this is, I mean, it was a new way of interpreting this law, taking very seriously a set of obstructions to the whale's form of life that did not involve the infliction of pain. The opinion, written for a unanimous three-judge panel by Judge Ronald Gould, who sits in and has long lived in the state of Washington, where whale watching is a common pastime, concluded that obstructing a characteristic form of life activity, even without pain, is an adverse impact. I imagine this judge, don't know him at all, as someone who has really looked at whales with curiosity and wonder. But whether he or his clerks have really gone out whale watching, the opinion displays ethical and imaginative attunement of a type increasingly seen in coastal areas of the US, perhaps in the Seattle area where he lives above all. It sees whales as complex beings with an active form of life that includes emotional well-being, affiliation, and free movement. In short, a variety of species-specific forms of agency. The opinion goes well beyond Jeremy Bentham, and it also steers clear of the so like us approach. Nor, like the Kantian approach, does it view whales as merely passive citizens. It is a harbinger, it is to be hoped, of a new era in the law of animal welfare and animal justice. So thank you very much. I look forward really greatly to your questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Nussbaum, for the great lecture. I'm going to move to the audience really soon. Actually, would it be okay for you, because I think it is really nice in the book that you also spend a lot of time on the practical dilemmas that your theory faces in reality. Would it be okay if I pose one of the dilemmas to the audience to see what they... Yes? Sorry?
Whatever you want to do.
Great. Okay. So it's actually a very small example, but it kind of struck me. I wondered about some things about it. So the first dilemma would be, if we keep cats as companions in our houses, there's the dilemma of, do we let them go outside or not? And then in your book, you give these argumentations of course, if we let them out, they can enjoy playing, they have the freedom of movement, they can explore. But simultaneously, we can provide for them to play inside. And outside, there's a lot of danger. So, sorry?
I'm talking only about cats here, not dogs. I think there's absolutely no one who would say the dogs could be kept indoors. They have to go out.
Yes, definitely. We're talking about cats. Yes.
Okay.
Make that clear. So then the question is, do we think, would you think you would prefer letting a cat outside, even though it might risk them dying earlier than they should have? Or would you prefer keeping them inside? We would let their cat outside. Okay. Who would say, no, I will keep the cat indoors with me? Okay, so Professor Nussbaum, for you, the majority of people, I think, would let their cat outside, but could you maybe give your reasoning here?
You know, I think it depends entirely where you live, quite frankly. I mean, the dangers that cats encounter when they go outside, they're of many kinds. First of all, cars running them over, and that's not to be treated. Second, other animals attacking them and killing them, and that, again, depends where you are, what other kinds of animals are around. And third, various diseases that cats contract when they're outdoors. And again, that depends what diseases are prevalent. So in most of the United States, people, even animal lovers and animal rights activists prefer the indoors because there are just too many dangers. Coyotes are very common in the United States, in cities, but in the countryside it used to be, but now coyotes are in the city and they eat cats. So anyhow, that is the reason why most people in the United States would go away. But the Netherlands is a different place. So, you know, you have to take the situation into account.
Yeah. So, because it made me wonder, generally, in your capabilities approach theory, there's of course not a hierarchy in the different capabilities. You look at different cases and you look at which reflection to make on individual basis. But I felt like throughout your book and the examples you give and the dilemmas you face, there is quite a big weight put to making sure that life isn't ended earlier than it has to, or preventing death in a way.
You have the responsibility, if you do keep an animal of any kind, indoor or outdoor, to provide an enriched, interesting environment for that animal. So the solution is, if you decide on indoors, then it's incumbent on you to make that indoor life challenging, sensorily interesting, rich, with lots of things for the cat to do, et cetera, et cetera. And people who keep dogs, I think, as I say, they have to go outdoors. Most people, though, quite frankly, think, oh, well, if I'm in a city, I'll just walk the dog twice a day so that it can urinate and defecate, and that's all I'll do. That's not enough. You have to give it an interesting life. And there need to be I argue for more dog parks and where dogs can run off leash, et cetera. But in any case, this is really on you to give the animal, if you decide to take an animal into your home, then you have to figure out ways that it can express the full range of it.
But also, more generally in the book, I mean, there's, I think, a lot of weight put on making sure that animals can live as a prolonged life, so they don't, the life isn't cut off earlier than we have to. We have to protect the animals from dying in a way. Could you maybe explain why that capability is so important to you?
I'm thinking about the whole evolution of companion animals. Companion animals, as they evolved, came to lack various capacities for self-defense that wild animals have. And since we bred them and led them to have this vulnerability, then the duty is incumbent on us to protect them in their vulnerability. Just think about small children. Would you allow your small child to go walking out in the street without an adult present? You would not, because you would think there's dangers out there and the child has to be protected. So I'm not saying that length of life is always the be-all and end-all. I'm saying that particularly for companion animals, the particular nature of their evolutionary capacity dictates that we do protect them in the vulnerability that we have created.